Hi everyone, and welcome to today's video where, as you can see, we are going to be dealing with fractions. Now, what specifically are we dealing with? Today we are looking at the concept of putting fractions in order from either greatest to least or least to greatest. Now, as you can see, there are two methods that we are going to be dealing with, so I'm going to teach you both, and I'm going to describe to you when you would use both methods as we go along through this video. Now, don't forget that at any point you can pause this video and re-watch it, and I encourage you to do so if something doesn't make sense. All right, so let's get started. So the first method that we're going to be looking at is changing fractions into workable numbers. So on a previous video, we discussed that fractions can be changed into decimals, they can be changed into percentages, they can be changed into ratios. Now, how do we do that? Well, simply what we do is we take the top number and we divide it by the bottom number. The number of selected pieces divided by the total number of pieces. So in this case, if we had 1 out of 8 and we took 1 and divided it by 8, we are going to end up with decimal 125. Now, if we multiply that by 100, we're going to get 12.5%. Okay, so let's do the same thing with 3/4. Let's say you got 3 out of 4 on some type of assessment. Congratulations, good for you. 3 divided by 4 is going to give you decimal 75. Again, multiplied by 100, and you get 75%. If you take 7 divided by 8, you're going to get decimal 875, which again, multiplied by 100 is 87.5%, or 87.5%. And then if we looked at 2/3, we're going to get decimal 667 multiplied by 100, 66.7%, or 66.7%. Now, this, if we look at this, it's pretty easy to see which one of these is the smallest. The smallest number would obviously be decimal 125. It's a significantly smaller number than the rest of the numbers here. So if we were putting these in order of least to greatest, we know that 1/8 would have to come first. If we were looking at what the next one would be, we can see obviously here, now that this one's out of the way, that decimal 667 is a smaller number than decimal 75 and decimal 875. So we know that 2/3 would have to come next. And then if we continue on, we can see that 3/4 is smaller than 7/8. And we have now an order from least to greatest. So that is method number one, changing them from a fraction into a decimal or into a percent in order to write down least to greatest. Now let's switch colors, and we need a little bit more room for this one. And method number two, while there is a little bit more work associated with it, it's much more advantageous to do method number two because when we're dealing with addition of fractions and subtraction of fractions, you're going to need to do something that's called finding a common denominator. And if you're not familiar with what that term means, it means that we have to make our numbers, our bottom numbers, the denominator, all the same. So in fractions, we can manipulate fractions by dividing to make them bigger pieces, or we can multiply to make them smaller pieces. And that might not make a lot of sense, but it will in just a second, so bear with me as we go through this. So the first thing I want to do is I want to write out my fractions. I'm going to have 3/4, 7/8, and then finally 2/3. Now remember, the goal is to have all of these numbers on the bottom the same. So we have to be able to find a common factor between them. Now let's think about that for a second. A common factor means that if I took a number and I multiplied it by another number, I can get a number. So let's just draw this out for a second and bear with me as I go through this. If I had 8 and I multiplied it by 1, well, I get 8. If I had 8 and I multiplied it by 2, I'm going to get 16. If I had 8 and multiplied it by 3, I'm going to get 24. And then I'm just going to continue on this number line for, I don't know, say 6 numbers or something like that. So just to see if there's anything that works. So 8, 16, then 32, then 40, and then finally 48. And I don't know if you can actually see that. It might have been off the board. I'm going to move this one a little closer now. So I'm going to do the same thing with quarters. I'm going to start with 4 times 1. 4 times 1 is 4, then 4 times 2 is 8, then 12, then 16. And all I'm doing is adding 4 each time or multiplying 4 by the next number. So this would be 20, and then finally 24. And then if I went eighths here, I've already done eighths, so I don't need to do it again. But if I go down here to thirds, and I multiply 3 times 1, I get 3. Then 3 times 2 is 6. 3 times 3 is 9. And then I'm going to continue on. 12, 15, 18, 21, 24. And now that I have some multiples up here, some factors, I'm going to look for common ones, which means that the number shows up in all of the lines. So the first common number that I see here is 8. I see 8 shows up here, it shows up here, but it doesn't show up here. So I can't use that number because I can't multiply 3 by another whole number in order to get 8. So let's go to the next one. Let's see. I've got 16 and 16, but no 16 here. So again, that one doesn't work. But what about 24? 24 is here, 24 is here, and 24 is here. And that is the lowest number that I see that shows up in all of this multiplication stuff that I did. So I know that I can change my denominator into 24ths. Each of these can be multiplied by a number. Doesn't have to be the same number, but each of these can be multiplied by a number to equal 24ths. So how can I use this to figure out what I would multiply by? Well, if I simply just looked at what number in the sequence it is, this would be 8 times 1, 8 times 2, 8 times 3. I can multiply this by 3. And one of the things that you have to remember when you're dealing with fractions is that when you multiply the bottom, you have to multiply the top by the exact same thing. So in this case, 8 times 3, I would have to multiply 1 by 3. And that's going to change this fraction. It's not going to change the amount that it's worth, it's just going to change the way that it looks. So I'm creating what's called an equivalent fraction, and the equivalent fraction, equivalent means it's the same. So 1/8 is then going to be changed into 3 24ths. Now let's do the same thing with quarters. If I looked at the number sequence here, this was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I know that I can multiply 4 by 6, and 3 by 6 to change this fraction. Instead of 3/4, I can make it 18 24ths. And now notice, I want you to notice this is important because a lot of kids get confused about this. I don't have to multiply this number by the same number as this. So I multiplied this by 3, I multiplied this by 6. It doesn't have to be the same number, so don't get hung up on that. The goal is trying to get the denominator to be the same. So I've already done eighths, so I know that if I multiply this by 3 and this by 3, I'm going to end up with 24ths. And 7 times 3 is 21, or 7 groups of 3 is 21. And then finally, if I look down here, I've got 3, and if I counted out the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, I can multiply it by 8. I also could have just flipped this too. 8 times 3 and just flip them. So I multiply this by 8 as well. And that ends up with 16 24ths. So now that I've created common denominators, I'm just going to circle them in pink here. I know you can see them, but I'll just do it for effect. 24ths, 24ths, 24ths. These are all the same number. They're all common denominators. Now, in order to determine which one is least to greatest or in greatest to least, I just have to look at the top numbers and see which one is the biggest. So in this case, if we're going to go greatest to least, you can see that 21 out of 24 is I'll do it in pink again, 21 out of 24 is the highest out of all of them. So 21 is a larger number than 18, then 3, then 16. So I know that 7/8 is going to be my greatest number. And then if I look at the next one, I can see here that 18 is larger than 16, so 3/4 has to be my next number. And then I look at 16 is higher than 3, because those are the only two I have left. 2/3 is the next largest, and then finally I'm left with 1/8. Okay, so let's recap real quickly. We have two different methods that we're looking at. The first method was to take numbers and divide the top number by the bottom in order to find a decimal. As you can see, just by the amount of space here, significantly less work. Over here, method number 2 was trying to find common denominators. Now, common denominators are going to be important as we move into different concepts in fractions, being able to add and subtract, for instance. We'll need to be able to find common denominators as we do that. So when would I use method number one? Well, method number one would be if I was using a large amount of fractions. Let's say I had 7 or 8 fractions and they all had a variety of different denominators. I might take a long time trying to figure out method number two. Advantageous, sure, I could do that, but in the effort of efficiency and effectiveness, it might be better to use method number one in order to compare those fractions that way if you have a significant amount. I would use method number two when I'm getting ready to add, when I'm getting ready to subtract fractions, and I would want to get used to using this concept because manipulation of fractions is going to be important as we're moving on. Okay, so that is how to order and compare fractions, 2 different methods. As always, if you need to pause the video or go back and rewatch, I invite you to do so. If you have any questions, by all means, put them in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and as always, thanks for watching.